Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech, which is sponsoring tonight's lecture and discussion. And our mission is very broad. We aim to provide Civil War era educational opportunities to students here at Virginia Tech, to K through 12 teachers and their students, and to members of the public as well. And we're able to offer most of these programs for free because of the incredible generosity of our donors who are committed to the belief that understanding the Civil War era is more important now than ever before and deserves to be supported and encouraged. So we provide a lot of educational programming. You can find out about all of our activities at our website, of course, civilwar.vt.edu. Many of you, I'm sure, are already signed up for our email list and maybe heard about tonight's event through email. If you're not, you can sign up on the website. And of course, you can find us on social media as well, especially Facebook and YouTube. We're particularly active there. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Angela F. Murphy, who is a professor in the Department of History at Texas State University. And Dr. Murphy specializes in mid-19th century United States history and Atlantic history as well. So her previous publications include a book called American Slavery, Irish Freedom, Abolition, Immigrant Citizenship, and the Transatlantic Movement for Irish Repeal. Another book called The Jerry Rescue, The Fugitive Slave Law, Northern Rights, and the American Sectional Crisis. And of course, she's just published a brand new book, which we're going to be talking about tonight, which is Jermain Wesley Loguen, Defiant Fugitive. Dr. Murphy is going to talk to us about the book, introduce us to Jermain Loguen, and then we're going to have some time for questions and discussion. And the way you can submit your questions is through the Q&A box in Zoom, not through the chat, not through your microphone. We've got the cameras and microphones of attendees disabled. So if you type your question into the Q&A box, we will see it and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We're going to wrap things up in about an hour and 15 minutes total. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you being here with us. And I think we should give Dr. Murphy some kind of virtual round of applause as we welcome her to our screens. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. I guess I will just go on and jump right in. But first, I want to thank Paul for setting this up, allowing me to share some of my work on Jermain Loguen with everybody. And so the title of my talk is From Resistance to Reconstruction, Jermain Loguen and the Politics of Racial Uplift. Not many people know the name Jermain Wesley Loguen, a fugitive from slavery, abolitionist, minister, teacher, and political activist who resided for most of his adult life in Syracuse, New York. But he was a key figure in New York State's network of reform in the decades before the Civil War. And eventually he became a significant figure in a wider national movement for Black rights during the Reconstruction era. Those who have heard of Loguen associate him primarily with his aid to fugitives from slavery. His name most often comes up in conjunction with the Jerry Rescue of October 1851. He was a key participant in that successful community-wide effort to liberate a man arrested in Syracuse under the infamous Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. His leadership in sheltering and aiding fugitives from slavery in New York State has also gathered attention. Both contemporaries and scholars have referred to him as the king of the Underground Railroad. There is no doubt that Logan's resistance to the Fugitive Slave Law and leadership in the Underground Railroad are among his most important contributions to the African-American community. They're highlights of my biography of him. But in the emphasis on this work, we can lose sight of the full spectrum of Logan's efforts on behalf of Black rights. Therefore, in this talk, I want to explore Logan's broader reform efforts. And along the way, through the lens of Logan's activism, I want to address how biography can serve as a powerful tool of historical analysis. It allows us to transcend periodization and, in Logan's case, understand the continuity of Black resistance across time. These continuities are at times lost as we historians tend to zero in on a particular era in our teaching and scholarship. In the case of African American history, the Civil War is often treated as a cutting off point, the culmination of the hard-fought effort to eradicate slavery in the United States, and the beginning of the nation's struggle to integrate nearly 4 million freed people into the nation on a new basis. Work on behalf of the free people and the push for racial equality in the post-war era are usually considered separately from antebellum reform efforts regarding race. This is true both in the classroom and in scholarly works. This became particularly evident to me when I presented a paper on Loguen at a conference back in 2017 entitled Emancipations, Reconstruction, and Revolutions, African American Politics and U.S. History in the Long 19th Century. It was a joint conference held by the McNeil Center for Early American Studies and the CUNY Graduate Center, and its call for papers emphasized continuities in African American activism. The focus gave me the idea of connecting Loguen's work for racial justice before and after the war. I had just completed a book on the Jerry Rescue, and Loguen had played a central role in that event. I wanted to dig further into his story. To my surprise, my paper for that conference was one of the few that connected pre- and post-Civil War reform efforts. Most of the other papers dealt with one or the other. That said, the conference was enriching. The conversations held by presenters exposed the many connections between the two eras, separated by the great rupture of war. It was inspirational, and I realized that the reason my paper was less siloed than many of the others was because I had taken a biographical approach. A human life transcends periodization. It is therefore a natural lens for understanding both change and continuity in history. And when I say the conference was inspirational, I mean that literally. I left it with the goal of writing a biography of Loguen that included, but went beyond, the usual story of his aid to fugitives. I wanted to give a fuller view of his life's work. One of my big objectives was to show how Black activism before the Civil War laid the foundation for Reconstruction era efforts for equality and uplift. Through Loguen, I wanted to demonstrate that the struggle for Black freedom was never episodic. It was persistent, adaptive, and deeply personal. And so in this talk, I want to highlight Loguen's post-emancipation efforts to provide uplift for Southern freed people and promote racial equality throughout the nation, and connect those efforts to his work at the local and state level in New York before the Civil War. An exploration of Loguen's later in life activism and the way it relates to his earlier work is important, not just to demonstrate the extent of his historical contributions. Because of the scope of his activity, Loguen's political life provides a useful lens through which to view the broader 19th century movement for the expansion of African American rights. In particular, his work in education, material aid, and political organization illuminates the way in which Black activism extended outward from the anti-slavery movement, embracing a broad platform of racial uplift and social justice. An exploration of this work connects earlier exertions for state-level reforms that emerged after the Northern state emancipations of the first half of the 19th century, and efforts some historians now label a first Reconstruction, with the national efforts to encourage racial justice undertaken after the federal abolition of slavery following the Civil War. Throughout this entire period, Loguen's concerns remained remarkably consistent. His approach, although constantly adapting to the necessities of the time, unfailingly emphasized the duty of Northern African Americans to provoke change and promote equal opportunity for all members of their race. This approach is in many ways representative of that taken by the free Black community in New York State. Loguen and men like Samuel Ringgold Ward, Frederick Douglass, James McCune Smith, and Henry Highland Garnet participated in the state and national colored convention movement, and they all advocated political approaches to reform both before and after the war. Their focus was on the demand for equal rights for African Americans in the United States writ large, and they all embraced the idea that Black reformers should lead efforts to elevate their community. But Loguen's slant was also unique, for through it all, Loguen never lost sight of his status as a fugitive from slavery. The heartbreak of leaving his family behind in Tennessee as he built a new life for himself in New York always loomed over him. He clung to his fugitive identity, and he channeled this heartbreak to make a political point, sharing it freely in public forums. His personal experiences in both slavery and freedom informed his work, and they shaped his understanding of how best to raise the status of the Black community at the local and national levels. I want to start my exploration of Loguen's work with an episode that illustrates the multifaceted nature of his post-war activism, Loguen's return to his home state of Tennessee following the Civil War. So let's begin there. In March of 1865, Loguen received a letter from Tennessee. It was from fellow clergymen in the AME Zion Church. AME Zion is short for African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion, a Black offshoot of the Methodist Church. The letter invited him to visit their state, which so happened to be the one from which he'd escaped from slavery at the age of 21, 30 years prior. He had not been able to return the place of his birth since then. Throughout the antebellum period, members of the slaveholding Logue family considered him their lawful property and threatened to re-enslave him. The emancipations brought by the Civil War, however, nullified Tennessee laws that supported the Logues' claim. The way is open for you to come to your native state, the Tennessee clergy wrote to Loguen. Loguen accepted their invitation and departed that summer for a visit. He had several items on his agenda. He went to evaluate the condition of the freedmen and women in the aftermath of war and emancipation, speak to Southern audiences on the need for Black empowerment, organize schools and churches on behalf of the AME Zion Church, and, on a more personal level, reunite with the family he had left behind when he had run from his life in slavery on Manasseh and Sarah Logue's Tennessee farm near the town of Columbia. On this trip, he spent nearly 2 months traveling throughout Tennessee, giving sermons and speeches along the way as he visited with the freed people and evaluated their needs. His most important oration was a 4th of July speech given in Nashville, the only one in the city that summer, to a mostly Black crowd of around 3,000 people. This speech illustrates Loguen's key concerns. In it, he emphasized that, quote, nothing short of the ballot would protect the people of his race at the South, unquote. He also called for material aid for the freed people and for Black teachers and clergy from the North to preach and organize schools in the former Confederate states. He emphasized the duty of the Northern Black community to take the lead in providing for the brethren in the South and encouraging justice for their race. The fates of African Americans in both the North and the South were intertwined, and it was the responsibilities of those who had been able to elevate their own condition and who had gained knowledge and experience agitating for Black rights in the Northern states to act on behalf of Black communities throughout the nation. And fugitives such as himself, he argued, had a special duty to reach out to those they had left behind in slavery. Loguen was one of many Northern African-American reformers who streamed south after the Civil War. He and others like him sought to use their experiences in promoting racial justice in the North during the antebellum years to encourage the same in the post-emancipation South. Their work highlights the emphasis that 19th century Black reformers placed on Black self-help and on the need for Black reformers to take the lead in the struggle for racial justice. Although Loguen's goal was racial equality in the United States, and although he worked with prominent white reformers as well as Black activists, Loguen felt it was the duty of Black Americans to take responsibility for themselves and their larger community. White efforts would never be enough to promote full justice for the Black community. Black Americans needed to act. Loguen's language often promoted what sounded like Black separatism, but he was no Black nationalist. He simply saw the power of Black solidarity in promoting change. All in all, the trip to Tennessee was successful. Loguen followed it up with fundraising and calls to action as he spoke to audiences throughout New York when he returned home. A year later, he received a letter from Bishop J.J. Clinton of the AME Zion Church in Tennessee, informing him that the seeds sown by his trip had produced abundant fruit. Enough AME Zion ministers and churches had appeared in the state in order to organize a conference, and schools for the free people had been established throughout Tennessee. He requested that Loguen continue his work on behalf of the free people through fundraising efforts in New York, a task into which Loguen put great energy. The trip had also been important to Loguen on a personal level, for it was during this visit that he was able to reunite with his mother. He wrote home to friends in Syracuse about the reunion, commenting on how the strong, youthful woman he remembered was now bent with age. She recognized him immediately when he approached. He asked her how this was possible given the decades that had passed since he had fled from Tennessee as a young man. And she told him she knew him by his walk. He also wrote of his pride in seeing her in the audience as she attended one of his lectures. At its close, she came and took him by his hand. Just as he had used the story of his grief at leaving her behind in slavery in his anti-slavery lectures before the Civil War, Loguen now used the story of their reunion to speak to the possibilities of freedom that came with emancipation. This reunion was a poignant moment of closure to one of the heaviest burdens of his lifetime. When he ran away to freedom as a young man, changing his name from Jermain Logue to Jermain Wesley Loguen, he grieved at leaving his mother behind in slavery. And in 1844, anti-slavery colleagues in New York raised money to procure her freedom and sent an agent to Tennessee to negotiate the purchase with Manasseh Loeb. That negotiation was stymied, however, when Loeb refused to release her unless Logan also purchased his own freedom, something that he's publicly stated he would never do. I have long since resolved to do nothing and suffer nothing that can any way apply that I am indebted to any power but the Almighty for my manhood and personality, he argued. Even at the cost of leaving his mother in slavery, Logan could not violate this principle. Logan, in fact, defiantly clung to his fugitive status throughout the entire antebellum period. In 1850, when Congress passed a new fugitive slave law that empowered the federal government to assist in the return of fugitives to the South, Logan's friends urged him to either purchase his freedom or flee to Canada in the face of the new threat to his safety. He refused to do either. Instead, he worked with other activists in Syracuse to defy the law. It outlaws me, he proclaimed, and I outlaw it. Through the 1850s, he experienced frequent scares as rumors circulated that slave catchers were looking for him in Syracuse. Logan remained firm and resolved, and he used his status as a fugitive to great effect as he agitated against slavery. His strategy was fully evident in 1860 when he responded to a letter he received from Sarah Logue, widow of the man who had claimed him as a slave. It demanded compensation for his theft of himself. She threatened to send slave catchers after him if he refused to pay her. Logan, disgusted by the letter, wrote a scathing reply and published both pieces of correspondence in the press. In this act, he publicized both the horrors of the institution of slavery and his disdain for an attempt to intimidate him. Although the U.S. government considered him a fugitive, he was confident that he was safe in Syracuse, where he had for years publicized his home address in local papers as a refuge for other fugitives from slavery. The agony of the decision to maintain his fugitive status, even at the cost of freedom for his family left behind in Tennessee, shaped Logan's life's work. Helpless with regard to his own loved ones, he committed his life to providing aid to those members of his community whom he could. Before the Civil War, he had dedicated himself to the effort to aid others in shaping new lives after escaping slavery. After emancipation, he pledged to work to help all African Americans enjoy the fruits of freedom. As I mentioned earlier, during this later period, Logan became particularly active in the national effort to promote social justice for African Americans in three areas: education, economic uplift, and political participation. Now, I'd like to talk about each of these three areas in a bit more detail, connecting Logan's post-war efforts with his experiences and lessons learned in his work before the war. So first, let's delve into how Logan's lifelong commitment to Black education culminated in his efforts to establish and fund schools for freed people after the Civil War. Logan was appointed in 1864 by the AME Zion Church as a missionary agent, and later he became a bishop in the church. In these roles, he traveled periodically through the South to promote uplift in education for the freed people, but his most significant contributions to education in the Reconstruction era came through recruiting teachers and channeling donations for Black freedmen's education from New York State. From the late 1860s until his death in 1872, Logan toured New York, speaking, raising funds, and urging Northern reformers, especially Black reformers, to aid in providing for the education of the formerly enslaved. His visits often sparked biracial freedmen's aid societies, largely led by women, to collect money and supplies. Logan stressed that Northern and Southern African Americans could learn much from one another, and the Black teachers for the freed people were vital as role models. He argued that fugitives had a divine duty to help those left behind in slavery. He also noted practical benefits as well, pointing out that, quote, Black teachers could eat and sleep and live with Blacks and sympathize as no white person can. His appeals for education for the freed people drew large audiences, and Logan often linked his message to his own story. After escaping slavery, his inability to read left him dependent on others, convincing him that education was essential for freedom. He learned to read in Canada and then attended the Oneida Institute in New York, later founding a school for Black children in Utica in 1841. Excluded from public schools, despite their parents paying taxes, the children at this school studied in a rented room, and Logan organized public exhibitions to showcase their talents. Knowledge is power, he said, the only means whereby we shall contend for our rights. Logan's activism expanded when he married his wife Caroline and moved to Syracuse a few years later. He was determined to aid the Black populations of the Black population of his new town, and his early work there involved the building of a Black church and school. Loguen viewed his ministry and education as twin levers for racial justice, and he would continue to marry this work for many years. After he became a minister in the AME Zion Church, he was assigned as a minister to towns across New York beginning in the 1840s and continuing sporadically through the end of the Civil War. In these towns like Ithaca, Bath, and Troy, he organized churches and schools, honing fundraising schools that later fueled his Southern campaigns. The focus of his early endeavors for Black education in the 1840s arose from necessity. Private Black schools filled gaps left by New York school districts that denied African Americans access to public schools. By the 1850s, as more public schools opened to Black children, Loguen shifted to advocating integration. Eventually, though, the absence of Black teachers in the newly integrated schools began to trouble him and convinced him that separate schools led by Black teachers would best serve the needs of Black students. Thus, when Reconstruction began, Loguen advocated separate education as a choice, and he vigorously promoted Black-run freedmen's schools, a vision rooted in decades of activism and his own journey from bondage to leadership. Okay, shifting to the next area in which Logan's experience before the war informed his Reconstruction era efforts, let's look at his promotion of economic uplift for African Americans. Logan's push for education was inseparable from his belief that it enabled economic independence. And so, alongside raising funds for freedmen's schools during Reconstruction, he worked to provide material aid and job opportunities. His efforts for the free people started as the war ended. In 1864, after a visit to Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, Loguen returned home and delivered orations that detailed the sick and suffering he had encountered among the emancipated of that state. He took up collections for their relief. He understood that there were immediate needs to be met before one could speak of elevating the condition of the individual or the race. But he also understood that meeting those immediate needs was not enough. Reformers must also help those who are struggling to achieve economic independence once they were on their feet. His many years aiding fugitives from slavery who came through Syracuse had reflected this understanding. Loguen and his family took them into their home and provided them with food, medicine, and clothing, but they also helped them to find jobs and economic opportunities in Syracuse or other towns in which they settled. Between 1855 and 1858, Loguen stepped down from the pulpit to work full-time on his Underground Railroad activities. When he did this, his family had to rely on economic support from churches and humanitarian organizations for their own subsistence, as well as their aid for fugitives. The Loguen family relied on the steady stream of money and supplies that Loguen collected from area churches. Women's organizations in Syracuse, white and Black, also threw donation parties to collect supplies, calling for them to be delivered to Logan's well-advertised home at 293 East Genesee Street. Loguen thus understood the importance of charitable relief as a precursor to accomplishing other forms of uplift. But Loguen also championed practical training and self-reliance. In the 1850s, he urged Syracuse citizens to give Black youth opportunities in trades and agriculture. He connected those seeking work with employers around upstate New York, acting as a sort of one-man employment agency. And his advocacy continued after the war. In 1869, he addressed the National Colored Labor Convention, which met in Washington, D.C., and demanded fair wages, better jobs, and land ownership for African Americans. He and the other delegates called for organizing Black labor as a step towards eventual biracial unity, mirroring Logan's stance on education: separate efforts now, integration later. Land ownership, another pillar of independence, also concerned Loguen. Along with other Black reformers, Loguen complained of the lack of attention that the Republican Party gave to the material needs of the freed people following emancipation, especially regarding access to land. This was a particularly potent issue in the first years after the Civil War, as many reformers considered it essential to freedmen's economic independence. But it wasn't a new concern. In the 1840s, Loguen and fellow prominent Black reformers in New York focused on the importance of land ownership as an engine for economic uplift, as they helped wealthy abolitionist Gerrit Smith distribute 140,000 acres of land to around 3,000 Black New Yorkers. These grants aimed not only to encourage economic independence among Black New Yorkers, but also political power. For in antebellum New York, Black men faced a $250 property requirement and a 3-year residency rule to vote, restrictions not imposed on white men. So this leads us to the third area in which Loguen worked both before and after the war, the promotion of political equality. Loguen fought inequalities such as the New York suffrage requirements throughout his life, convinced that equal access to the ballot was essential to protect Black interests. Loguen also recognized that it wasn't just the vote that was important to African Americans. They also needed to organize to promote their community's interests. Loguen thus participated in political organizations that prioritized African American rights. He became active in the Colored Conventions movement in the 1840s, a key organization in the promotion of Black uplift and the push for equal political rights. Loguen embraced both aims, building strong Black institutions while pressing for equal suffrage, and he supported the anti-slavery Liberty Party that had gained strength in New York at that time. He urged African Americans to use the vote for change and back the nomination of Black candidates, and he even ran for state senate in 1849. Though unsuccessful in his candidacy, he remained active. In 1855, Loguen participated in the formation of the New York State Suffrage Association, which attacked inequality in New York suffrage laws and encouraged the establishment of local Black political associations throughout the state. By this time, the Liberty Party had weakened as members abandoned it for the Republican Party. The Republicans attracted a broader constituency by focusing on halting the extension of slavery into new territories rather than on ending slavery outright, as the Liberty Party did. And many political abolitionists began to feel that this new party's broader constituency provided the best option for political progress in the crusade against slavery. Loguen himself would eventually join that party as he grew to see it as a vehicle for change. But before he did so, he participated in the short-lived Radical Abolitionist Party, which attempted to maintain the Liberty Party's unconditional approach to abolition and Black equality. In 1860, New Yorkers voted upon the question of equal suffrage in the state. But sadly, overwhelming numbers of voters rejected the measure. Logan's quest for political racial equality in New York thus continued throughout the Civil War and into the Reconstruction era. After emancipation, he expanded his efforts to agitate for equal access to the vote, not just in his home state, but in the United States at large. In 1864, he hosted a national colored convention in Syracuse, and out of that convention came the formation of the National Equal Rights League, which promoted legal racial equality and Black manhood suffrage in the nation by agitating for what would eventually become the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. This National Equal Rights League served as an umbrella organization for state equal rights leagues that were formed throughout the United States. And as an aside, I wanted to just mention also that Logan's vision for voting rights included women. He is one of the few members of the league that supported the women's vote, but his attempt to make it part of the platform was overruled by those that felt it would hurt the push for Black suffrage rights. And another aside, it was not until the ratification of the 15th Amendment that New York struck down the discriminatory property and residency requirements in the state constitution. So Logan's national agitation eventually helped him fulfill his earlier state level political goals. Loguen also recognized the power of the Black vote and sought to organize Black Americans as a united voting bloc. After the Civil War, he worked to unite Black voters behind the Republican Party. He chaired committees and participated in conventions to organize statewide canvassing. His work as a political organizer continued into his death in 1872. The summer before he died, he campaigned for Ulysses S. Grant's reelection, and his final public act was a speech at a colored convention calling for Black unity behind Grant. Logan's approach to party politics was much like his approach to education and economic uplift. In all of these areas, he emphasized the duties of Black reformers to take responsibility for the Black community's welfare and to cultivate Black solidarity and their demands for racial justice. His own life's work was driven by these duties, first at the local level in New York and then more broadly in the nation. Loguen did not, however, eschew cooperation with white reformers. He worked with white abolitionists in New York to raise money for schools and provide aid for fugitives from slavery. He sought jobs for young Black New Yorkers with white employers. He joined with white reformers like Gerrit Smith in his land distribution efforts and in the political anti-slavery parties that emerged throughout the North. And he participated in a movement to encourage white and Black laborers to unite to further working class interests. Logan's goal was a society in which white and Black were fully equal, and the distinctions of race did not affect one's position in the nation. Because of the realities of 19th century American racism, however, Loguen realized that African Americans had to take charge of their own education, economic uplift, and political organizing in order to truly meet the needs of the Black community and affect change. Logan's experiences as both a fugitive from slavery and as one who had dedicated his life to aiding other members of his race in freedom had taught him these lessons. Although white philanthropists contributed to his varied efforts, members of the Northern Black community had taken the lead in the work to elevate the condition of the race and promote legal and political racial equality in the North. He had experienced the power of this Black network in antebellum New York as he worked with other African Americans in the AME Zion Church, the Colored Conventions movement, anti-slavery political parties, and the Underground Railroad. Loguen thus believed that he and his Northern compatriots should continue to direct the exertions for African American uplift and equality in the South and elsewhere in the nation after the Civil War. Their education and experience had provided them for the task of nurturing Black community institutions and political solidarity. So what is the larger point here? Why do these connections between Logan's early and later activism matter? They matter because they show us that resistance is not episodic, it's continuous. It adapts and persists, and Logan's life's work is a testament to that. And as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, examining the course of Logan's activism also illustrates how biography can serve as a powerful tool of historical analysis. For his story provides a clear example of how a human life expands beyond the barriers of historical periodization through which we often view the past. For Loguen, resistance was not a moment or a season. It was a lifetime. His political life shows us how activism adjusts to new situations, but it doesn't end. His work exposes the thread of continuity in Black activism that traditional historical periodization can obscure. It shows us how history is a lived experience and not just segmented eras with discrete events and concerns. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. What an incredible story of this life. We've got a question already here, and I invite other members of the audience, type away, put your questions into the Q&A box. We look forward to hearing what you think. So first question, it's actually a two-part question. Are there any descendants of the Loguen family still living that we know of? And are there any markers or exhibits in New York that honor him?
I have not found any living descendants. I've looked on the genealogy websites. I was able to trace some of his members of his family. Up until the 1960s, they were kind of a prominent family in New York City. A lot of his descendants were musical artists that seemed to run in the family. There are quite a few lawyers. I talk in the end of the book a little bit about his children and some of their political activism that followed in his path. So I was able to trace it, and I kind of lost the thread of the Loguens after like the 1950s and 60s. I'm sure that somebody that's really good at genealogy might be able to dig up more. There are some historical markers. There is a statue in Syracuse that honors the Jerry Rescue, and Loguen is depicted in that statue along with some of the other rescuers. There's a mural there that's been painted that kind of depicts his family receiving fugitives, and his home no longer exists. It became a like Rite Aid drugstore, I think. And the last I saw, I haven't checked recently, the last I saw it had gone defunct and it was empty, I think around COVID. So I don't know what's there now. I think there is a marker saying that that's where that happened. So there's a little bit there honoring the Loguens.
Yeah, thank you. And on the subject of descendants, wouldn't it be nice if you come across some of his descendants who have heard about the book or something like that? I've heard of that happening with other books where descendants kind of get wind of the book and introduce themselves to the author.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love that. And then I'd have to like write an article or something about that since I was unable to find them while I was writing.
Yeah. We've got a question. What theme in his life can we draw from when we think about politics today? What's the lesson of Logan's life?
I mean, I think one of the things one of the things I always think about with Loguen was that he kept pushing, even though he was up against the worst of odds. I mean, The government at the time was basically completely controlled by those that wanted to continue slaveholding. It was very frustrating, but he and other abolitionists just kept pushing and pushing, and eventually their voices kind of started to affect things. Even if not directly, more and more people kind of started moving in the direction of anti-slavery in the North. And I think it's a really good lesson now for people that may be frustrated that even though it feels like you can't make change very easily through government institutions at the present moment, that if you continue to organize, if you continue to focus on education, if you continue to like treat other people with kindness and be concerned about what's happening with our fellow man, that eventually we can have success. It's not impossible. So that is one big lesson. And I think another that I tried to highlight in the speech was that when you have these voting blocks and these kind of episodes of where there's like Black solidarity, it's to draw attention to need. It's not trying to say there's separate special group. It's saying we're going to unite and like let people know what our situation is. And in doing so, hopefully we will bring everybody on board with the reforms that we're proposing. And I think that that was foremost in Logan's mind as he said about his political organizing.
Thank you. We've got a fairly specific question. One viewer is asking if you can take a moment or two to speak about his daughter, Amelia, and her marriage to Civil War veteran and the oldest son of Frederick Douglass, Lewis
Yeah.
Douglass. I know Reverend Logan and Frederick Douglass knew each other and worked together for many years. And then this person also says, thank you again for this important contribution.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, Amelia was married to Frederick Douglass's son. Douglass and Logan worked together pretty closely. They beginning in the early 1850s, Logan wrote regularly to Frederick Douglass's paper and promoted, anti-slavery, and especially wrote about the plight of fugitives and promoted aid to fugitives. They toured together, Frederick Douglass and Jermain Logan as well at times, and they went into churches and spoke together. And so they actually were really pretty close colleagues. They both also worked together with John Brown. They both kind of notoriously were in communication with him before his infamous raid. And Amelia did marry Douglas's son. She was quite a striking figure herself. She helped with the Underground Railroad. I write a little bit in the book about how all of the family contributed to that effort. She was a big women's rights advocate. I found some things talking about how she wore bloomers and how like she was kind of loath to give up her teaching career to get married. It took her some time before she agreed to get married. So I wish I could find more than I have on his daughters and his wife, Caroline, because they are just as important as Logan and as far as the Underground Railroad goes and aid to fugitives. I mean, they were active themselves. And so I've dug up some information on them, which I talk about in the book, but I really, really wish I could find even more because they all seem like such impressive women.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me from reading the book is, Logan was away from home fairly often. And when he was away from home, it was his wife and children who were basically operating this underground railroad
Yeah.
station. Lots of work.
Yeah, it's like he was seen as the kind of station master of the Underground Railroad and received fugitives in his home, but he was often gone. He spent a lot of time raising funds to keep it going and going around giving speeches, trying to gain support for others for the cause. And then he also had a ministry early, even before and after he dedicated himself fully to the Underground Railroad full time. But during that time, his children and his wife did a lot of the heavy lifting. And when you read some of the stories of how many people came through the home and how, like in the middle of the night, and at any time of day, they would have to get up, receive people, feed them, make sure that they were warm. There's some really good stories of the work that they did there.
Mhm. One audience member has already read the first two chapters of the book, but they want to apologize if this question was answered later in the book. But did he work with any prominent white politicians during Reconstruction, like members of Lincoln's cabinet or anything like that?
When he did, I did find that wasn't able to find many details, but I do know that um, when he went into the South to tour, there was some communication with Oliver Howard on that Freedmen's Bureau. So there was some discussion, I think, between some of these religious reformers and the political kind of effort to aid freedmen there. But I didn't find a lot of details on that. One of the interesting things I found in the research was that he did have a letter from President Johnson, of all people, promising him safety as he journeyed south to go and tour during that first visit to Tennessee. His friends in New York said, you really need to make sure you have protection, because even if you might be safe in Tennessee, you have to go through Kentucky, which was a border state, and he might not be as protected from people trying to seize him there. So he had a letter of like protection from President Johnson that he carried with him, and he actually had to use it at one point in Kentucky on the way to Tennessee. So he didn't really have that much like connection with him, but he did have that letter. So that was really kind of fun to find. I can't think of anything else beyond those right now. So, but those are two things that stand out during the Reconstruction period.
Yeah, thank you. We were talking about his wife, Caroline, a few moments ago. One viewer is interested in hearing more about her. Was she from the South? Was she born into slavery? What was her story?
So she was born free, and she was from New York, and her family actually ran their own Underground Railroad effort before he met her. He met her, she was traveling and visiting friends in Utica when he opened up that school in Utica and was teaching. And he was in school at the Oneida Institute and teaching in Utica. And then he met her and married her very quickly. And he often commented on how proud he was that she was so very well educated and well spoken, and he looked up to her because she was everything that he wanted to be as well. And so they made a really good team, and they both were very dedicated to aiding others throughout their whole life. Yeah.
Great partnership, it sounds like.
Mhm.
So one person is asking, how did you first get interested in this general topic, the Jerry rescue, the fugitive slave law, and then, of course, from there on to Logan himself?
Yeah, I was this girl from Texas doing here. So I went to graduate school in Texas. I teach in Texas, but I went to graduate school at the University of Houston. And my very first class was a research seminar with Richard Blackett, who writes about fugitive slave law and such himself. And that seminar, our assignment was to pick any city in the North and write about the impact of the fugitive slave law on it. And I wrote this paper for that class on Syracuse. So it was like the very beginning of my graduate career. I wrote that paper. I did turn it into an article, and then I moved on and did my first book, which was about Irish American immigrants and their kind of opinions on slavery and abolition, which was an interest I had kind of developed myself. But when I finished that, I just came back to the story of the Jerry rescue and Syracuse, and wrote a book on that. And then as I wrote the Jerry rescue, my decision in that book was to kind of make it based on all the different figures that were involved in the rescue. But Logan stood out to me, almost threatened to take over the book. And so I kind of, in the back of my mind, knew I wanted to write a biography of him. And so I just kept doing the research, and then it developed from there. So I kind of it was, just the influence of a good teacher in school that kind of pulled me into this direction.
Great. I'm glad that happened. It resulted
Yeah.
in a fantastic book. I'd like to ask actually about the cover of the book. We've got this great, really arresting photo of Logan on the cover. Is this the only photo? Are there others? What did it feel like when you found this photo? How far along in your research? All of that.
That it's in the Onondaga Historical Association. They have that photo. I think I had seen it early on. There's some like drawings of Logan that have been used as well, that I think he had in the front piece of his own memoir. But no, there's one other picture of Logan, and he's an older man in that picture. And I felt like this one was like him at the prime of his life. So I selected to use that one. And there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good one, and it
Yeah.
reminds me a bit of Frederick Douglass being
Yeah.
the most photographed 19th century person and all of that. And
Yeah.
with Douglass, of course, there are different photos at different stages of his life, which send very different messages about what kind of person, and even just his physical presence
Yeah.
is different at different stages.
Yeah, just building on that. So I have the two photos that I found. And I had colleagues even mention to me, oh, that's kind of reminds me of a picture of Frederick Douglass. The hair is similar and everything, I guess. But there is this picture of both. There's a portrait of Caroline Logan and Jermain Logan that I think that they have housed at Howard University. And they're portraits of them, but they're very Europeanized, like you almost wouldn't recognize them. And so it kind of, I know the people that have looked at how Douglass was depicted over time talk about the different ways he kind of shows up in some of his pictures and paintings to serve whatever purpose. I didn't include those. I just wanted the one photo of Douglass, and I didn't delve too deeply into pictures. There are some pictures of Amelia, since someone asked about Amelia, and of Sarah Logan, which was his other daughter. But unfortunately, Howard was like kind of shut down when I was publishing this. I wasn't able to get photo rights, so I wasn't able to include those pictures. But there are some pictures of his children that are floating around as well. You can find them online. There's some copies of them online. So
Yeah, I feel like there's something a little bit magical when you're researching a historical figure and you get to know them through their words, but then
mhm.
when you see them actually photographed or even in a portrait or a drawing, it's
Yeah.
really cool. Um, we have a question about the research process. Could you say more about the kinds of materials you consulted in your research, how you located relevant source materials in an era when people think you can just ask the internet or the chatbot? I love to have historians detail what real research entails. Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so as I mentioned, I started this with a paper on Syracuse, that was in the year 2000. So that it was a long time ago. So that's where I began my research. So luckily I was able to collect a lot of work from the Onondaga Historical Association. When I was writing that paper for my class, I actually was able to take a trip to Syracuse and go through, and it was literally sitting in the archives and going through file folders with like clippings and reports and like hands-on archival research, which made it kind of fun. So I got a lot of information way back in the day that I still was able to use later on. And then when I kept on with Logan, I revisited that archive and expanded some of my research there. But as I was writing the book, I did consult, as many people do now, the newspaper databases that are available. A lot of 19th century historians rely very heavily on 19th century newspapers because they were kind of archives in themselves. The newspapers weren't like just news reports and editorials. They had those, but they also included like full on minutes of meetings and that sort of thing. And so looking at through all these newspapers, and I looked through so many of them, I was able to collect a lot of information that way. There's a Colored Conventions website, a website dedicated to all of the Colored Conventions minutes and such that was so helpful in getting all of his political activity down. I highly recommend that to anybody that's interested in any aspect of African American history. So those databases really are enormously helpful. I spent some time in New York one summer too, and went around to a lot of the some of the local archives in the surrounding area. Syracuse University has some materials that were useful as well. And then as far as the Logue family and his time in slavery, I relied a lot. If anybody that's looked at the book, the first couple chapters, I relied a lot on his own fugitive narrative to tell that story. But I did go to Tennessee and kind of there's some genealogical material on the Logue family that helped me to kind of verify some of the information that he had in his book, and that helped to kind of explain kind of how they got where they were in Tennessee and such. And then there's one other book-length biography of Logan by a woman named Carol Hunter, who sadly has passed away. And she did a biography of Logan for her dissertation and then published it. And it was back in the 90s. And it was very, very good. It was, considering she had no access to the internet, I mean, at all, she was able to do a lot of research. And so reading her book and looking at the sources she used helped me to really map out where I wanted to go and look. And I was able to kind of enrich all that with wider availability of source materials that we have now, but also grounding his story. One of the things I really wanted to do is ground his story in the larger kind of history of the period. And so I benefited, from all of the great scholarship on African-American history in the 19th century, in order to kind of make sense of his life, if you will.
Thank you. Picking up on what you said about the newspaper databases you're able to search for information in, I feel like one of the things that facilitated that for this particular project is that he's got a fairly unusual name. So if you
Yes.
search for his name and you don't get, thousands and thousands of results like you would for John Brown or something. Can you say a little bit about the significance of his name and how he got to his particular name?
Yeah, so he was born Jarm Logue, and last name of this, the family that enslaved him, and his father was his enslaver. And he was actually kind of raised in his early years within the family, kind of in a special status, since his father was his owner, and he was in Tennessee, and he treated him differently, but eventually did sell him and his mistress, what he would call his mistress, his mother, to his brother, who is a lot crueler. But he was given the name Jarmlogue, and then after he escaped, there's a moment in his narrative of his flight where he talks about when he arrived in Canada, as soon as he basically kind of set up his first home in freedom, he's like, I need a new name. And so he changed Jarm to Jermain, which he thought was I guess close enough, but a little bit more, I guess, dignified in his view. And then he just added Logan. He added an en to Logue, which is why his last name is very unique. And then Wesley, after John Wesley, the Methodist minister, because he had been kind of learning to read in the Methodist church there. So it's Jermain Wesley Logan became his name. And it is very unique, and that was extremely helpful, because if you search Logan, it's going to be him. I mean, I just very rarely, I mean, I don't even know if that I ever saw anybody else with the last name. So him, and that's why I was able to trace some of his descendants for a while too, by just looking at Logan in newspapers all the way through. Sometimes though, when people wrote about him, and I've had people ask this too, like, how do you pronounce his name? And I pronounce it Logan just because in some places I did see people spell his name Logan. So they assumed that that would be the name. So I figured that's how he pronounced it. And I don't even know how many citations I might have missed by not finding all the Logans, because that was obviously much more common. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the part in the book where he comes up with his new name and, you as an author present that as a big turning point. Now he's a new man and a new kind of future becomes possible for him. Are there other moments in his life that you think were especially transformative, important turning points where another future becomes possible for him?
Well, obviously his escape from slavery, and that's the success doing that. Well, his decision to escape, actually, I would start there, because he, in the course of being enslaved, he was sent to work for a neighbor of Manasseh Logue, who basically he was mortgaged out. It was kind of an interesting situation. Manasseh Logue several times did this. He would basically take out a mortgage and to pay off debts, and the interest was served by Logan's labor. And then once he would pay off his debt, he brought him back home. And he spent a year or two with a family he called them the Prestons in his narrative. That wasn't the real name. He was actually shielding their identity, because they actually did not agree with slavery, but they were living in Tennessee, and they treated him almost like an equal. Well, not exactly like an equal, but more like a hired hand. And they educated him. They helped him start to learn his alphabet, so that later he could learn to read. They put him in charge of managing a lot of the agricultural affairs, and he gained a lot of confidence in himself there and a sense of his own rights and dignity. And then when Manasseh Logue came and took him back home, he said, I can't go back into slavery. So he made that experience kind of provoked him to seek his freedom. And then he ended up running earlier than he planned because his sister was sold away from him. And he was like, if I, I don't want to leave my family, but if I stay, there's no guarantee I won't be sold away. So he runs. So that was a big moment. And then changing his name, I mean, meeting Caroline and moving to Syracuse kind of set him on this path of becoming a minister and an activist. The Jerry rescue, the rescue of the fugitive slave in New York, really probably before that, the passage of the fugitive slave law was a big turning point for him because it really made him vulnerable. He was always vulnerable, but it made him more vulnerable to the return of slavery. There are a lot of little moments, I think. And then I would say another big one is the Civil War itself and emancipation, because that shifted his energy towards more of a national effort.
Yeah, that's great. And we've actually got a question about the Civil War and what his take on the war was. How did he feel when it broke out? What kind of war did he want it to become?
Yeah, so on the lead up to the Civil War, like when the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all of these things happened, he actually kind of said, this is making people angry. It's bringing more people over to the anti-slavery cause. Sooner or later, something's going to happen. And he was warning throughout the 1850s. He was always promoting political action. He worked to the Liberty Party and the Radical Abolition Party and said, we need to legally end slavery. And he promoted political action. And he kept warning people, if we do not have political action that ends slavery, it will go down in violence. And he was, in fact, I think that was the last sentence of his narrative, is like, it will end in blood. When the war broke out, he depicted it as a holy war against slavery. He cheered it on. He said, if this is what has to happen to end slavery, I'm going to help raise Black troops. And he did. He helped to raise Black troops for Frederick Douglass's 54th, the famous troops there. And then he also, there was another batch called Logan's Guards that were raised during this time. So he promoted that, and he tried to push Lincoln and the Republican government to allow them to fight. And he saw this as their chance at, redemption in a way, and the nation's chance at redemption. So he depicted, he often called it a holy war. And so he supported the fight. He wanted it to end. He wanted it to end with emancipation, though. He insisted that that should be the goal throughout.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question about theology and what were the characteristics of Logan's theology when it came to discussing topics like emancipation and equality.
Yeah, like a lot of Black ministers at that time, and even all the way up till now, right? They were political figures as well. And so very much the way they thought about religion was as, all are equal in God's eyes, and he promoted that. I think I mentioned in the talk, he felt like his freedom was God-given, not given by any man, and he really stuck with that. One of the things I always point out is within the AME Zion Church, one of their precepts was that they would not work with slaveholding in any way whatsoever. So I think he also felt like really bound by that when he had the opportunity to purchase his freedom. That was one reason why he refused to do so. He also emphasized in his own ministry, he really emphasized an idea of usefulness, like being useful to God was really what your goal was in life. And you would see that term usefulness come up again and again, which was striking to me because it was something that was used when he was at the Preston family, where I mentioned they were very religious, which was one reason why they were a little bit more liberal than some of the others around them. And you'll just see him mention usefulness to God over and over and over. And he dedicated his life, and he had his children dedicate their lives to being useful to God. And that meant useful to his community as well.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got a couple of quick things. One is somebody's wondering whether a transcript or recording of tonight's event will be available. And indeed it will on our YouTube channel within about a week. And you can see some of our previous lectures up there as well for anyone who's interested in that. We've got one or two more questions. If you've got a question in mind, feel free to type it in. In the meantime, we have, I guess this one's more of a comment. Great presentation. This presentation was noteworthy for showing the importance of history in the biographical format. A lot of work is going on in Syracuse to remove Interstate 81 from downtown. Perhaps this could be a way to get more recognition with markers or art to bring Logan into public view beyond Dr. Murphy's excellent book.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any work being done in that direction, any kind of public history to recognize him?
I don't, there's some really great like internet sites that have a lot of information on them, like the Underground Railroad Trail, has some things listed there, places you can visit to recognize them. I don't know anything recent, to be honest, but I think that there has been some really good work done in Syracuse and beyond, and especially with regard to the Underground Railroad, really trying to kind of track that story and recognize some of the more unsung figures. And I think one of the things that I really like is that they're very much focused on how important the Black community was to the Underground Railroad. For a long time, it was kind of depicted as these kind of white Quakers that were helping others, and they were certainly there, but really the Black community did the heavy lifting in a lot of these communities. They brought people into their homes and they dedicated their lives. And there's just this constant flood of people coming through their home for, decade and a half. And just thinking about living that way and how much work that is, it's really important that it's recognized.
Yeah, really inspiring to read about it in your book as well. One last question from me. What's next for you now you're done with Jermain Logan? What's gonna
Yeah.
be next?
Yeah, so I kind of had two things I've been working on, and one is kind of hinted at by the talk, is I've really been trying to look at how abolitionists, the work of abolitionists informed a lot of the work during the Reconstruction era for freedmen's rights and such, and I've been kind of breaking down the radical abolitionists, the political abolitionists, the evangelicals, and how they all kind of had influence in the way freedmen's rights kind of took shape after the Civil War. So that's kind of something I've been playing around with for a while. But I've been spending most of my time in that work. I came across another biography I want to write of a woman named Cora L.V. Richmond, who is a spiritualist from New York. And what I find interesting about her, she's a medium and a spiritualist, but she tied her spiritualist kind of fame in a lot of ways. She used it in order to promote reform movements, both before and after the Civil War, especially with regards to American Indian rights, the labor movement, the women's movement, and then those sort of things. And so I'm always interested in reformers. And so this is kind of a little different take on a reformer, but I really caught the bug of writing biography and doing this book. It's just something special about following someone through their whole life and like feeling like you're getting to know that person and kind of looking at what their contributions are, and also how the world they live in shaped their approaches to their own lives. So those are two things I'm working on. They're both in their infancy right now, though. So
Nice. Well, we will look out for some more great work in the next few years, and
thanks.
biography in particular sounds amazing. Sounds like another really interesting life that can illuminate some of the big themes of 19th century US history.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the conversation tonight. Congratulations again on the book. I want to thank the donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies who made tonight possible. I also want to thank the audience members who spent this time with us. Most of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Murphy, for a wonderful talk, and congratulations on a terrific book.
Thank you. And thanks so much for hosting me and allowing me to share Logan's story with everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.